Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Zubaida Robinson, and I'm a team member of the Digital Communications team here at the World Bank, and also your host. Thank you so much for joining us today on this rainy morning for this event, Robots Coming for Your Job, live here in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters at the World Bank. And today we're going to talk about how some of our researchers have been looking into the potential effects of robots, AI, and other tech advances on jobs in the developing countries. They're going to present their studies and findings and take your questions on this important issue, so please stay tuned. I just want to remind you that this event is being live streamed on World Bank Live, so please send us your questions on Twitter using the hashtag #robotsandjobs. Up first, to help us get started today, is our keynote speaker, Jayla Pazabajolu, who is the Vice President of Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions at the World Bank. Jayla will take a few minutes to give us an understanding of the topic, why it matters, and why we should care. Over to you, Jayla. Welcome.
Thank you, Zubi. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers. I understand there's quite a bit online. So thank you for joining us today as we discuss this very critical issue. What will be the impact of automation and robots on jobs, especially in terms of work in developing countries? Why does this matter? Why are we discussing this issue? There are two main reasons. One is that the developing countries faced a key challenge, jobs. How do we make sure that we create 600 million jobs for the people who will be entering the workforce in developing countries over the next 15 years? And hundreds of millions of people are still underemployed or unemployed and unable to earn enough living for their potential. The vast majority of the poor, and this is the second reason, live in developing countries, and providing them with a livelihood, with a wage income, is really critical to reduce poverty. So the key question that we need to ask ourselves is whether this will be human replacing or human enhancing technology, and what is the role of public policy? So we will hear today from our researchers in terms of what the key findings are, what are the key questions, and I think I would like to urge you to think through, as we discuss these issues, what is the role for the World Bank, what is the role for public policy going forward? So in the advanced countries, automation is thought to be responsible for the loss of 25 to 50% of manufacturing jobs, and the key question is whether this will be the case for developing countries as well. So far, new technologies have been major drivers of job creation in many of the developing countries. In the last 40 years, companies all over the world have outsourced production to countries with lower labor costs. American, European, and Japanese firms moved a lot of their production to developing countries in Asia and Latin America. And we have seen export-led growth in many of the developing countries because firms were basically capitalizing on the differences, large differences between labor costs between rich and poor countries. So this helped countries like Malaysia and Chile at the beginning, and then others like China and Mexico, Vietnam, Bangladesh. Today, Chile and Malaysia are high-income economies. China and Mexico have become upper middle income, and Vietnam and Bangladesh have reached lower middle income status. Africa's turn was supposed to be next, but the widespread of robots in advanced economies is now raising a lot of concerns as to whether this will be the case, whether traditional labor-intensive processes will no longer offer the traditional pathway to grow and generate jobs. So robots can completely change what it takes to be competitive in the world market by reducing the importance of low wages in determining production costs. And we see this starting to happen. So the world's largest electronics manufacturing firm has recently announced that it will spend US $40 million on a new smart factory in Pennsylvania in the United States. Foxconn recently replaced 60,000 factory workers with industrial robots in China's Jiangsu province. So if high-income countries and developing economies are reshoring production, this could slow down and even reverse the migration of newcomers in global value chains. The case of China's rapid automation is potentially even more important given expectations of an eventual migration of light manufacturing activities from China to other parts of the world with lower labor costs. We know there's this, the example of automated teller machines, ATMs. In many countries, this has been much cited example of actually human enhancing technology. As the routine cash handling tasks of bank tellers receded, they increasingly engaged in much broader activities and services like credit cards, investment products, and so on. So the question we are trying to look at today is, will robots come for our jobs? I think for some jobs this will be inevitable. It is more a matter of time, perhaps 10 years, perhaps more, perhaps less. But it will take a lot of time for us to prepare for the jobs that will be created by automation and robotization. So I strongly believe that education and vocational training will be really critical in winning the race against machines. So policymakers will need to take a long-term view and take actions now to ensure that citizens in their countries are able to transition into new jobs. At the bank, we have two important agendas. One is jobs and economic transformation. You'll hear more about that today, as well as the human capital project. Both are very much linked to this area. So we will evidence that uncovers new insight and distinguishes. We will hear from colleagues on evidence-based work and ongoing work, forward-looking areas, and really trying to understand what are the questions that we need to do more research on, do more analysis on, and what are the key policy questions, as I mentioned before, that we really need to think through in terms of public policy in the production and the adoption of human-enhancing versus human-replacing technologies, and how do we best manage this transition. So I look forward to the discussion today, and wish you all a productive morning, afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jayla. Please, another round of applause for Jayla and that strong synthesizer. In the leading days to this event, we had asked some of you online a few questions on social media. We were testing your knowledge on robots and jobs. Nearly 2,000 people responded to this question. Which country has the most robots per worker? And over half of you chose the correct answer. Are you ready for this? The answer is South Korea. Now, up next, to tell us more about this topic and whether robots are joining human workers in the workplace or replacing them, are World Bank's William Maloney, Chief Economist, Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions, and Mary Hallward-Driemeyer, Senior Economic Advisor, Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions. Take it away, William.
So, good morning, and thanks to all of you for joining. Not yet. The question that many of us are already familiar with is what is causing what has become one of the most universal and preoccupying features of the post-1990 global economy, and that's the loss of manufacturing jobs in the advanced economies. As Jayla pointed out, and we confirm in our work, some very large fraction of that, perhaps 50%, is due to automation. And the question we're asking in this panel is exactly, are those same robots coming for our jobs in the developing world? Our bottom line is no, not yet. But countries need to be aware of the underlying dynamics of technology evolution in order to prepare their countries for what's likely to come. If we look here, we have here a spectrum of jobs from least skilled to most skilled. We see that for the advanced countries, elementary occupations, such as gardeners, demand for those jobs has gone up over time in absolute terms and as a share of the labor force. And at the other extreme, we have professionals, and their jobs are also expanding. What's been of most concern is this decline in the middle, in both absolute and relative terms, of operators and assemblers, what we tend to think of as characterizing the manufacturing sector. And that's what's giving this polarization in the literature. Are we seeing this in the developing countries as well? The answer is not so much. If you look at the orange bars, we see more or less an even growth, both in absolute terms and in relative terms, of jobs in the operator and assemblers category, as well as in professionals and in elementary occupations. So what's driving these different trends in the two different sets of countries? We first look at trade. Trade gets a lot of attention, and trade should get a lot of attention because external competition is responsible for job loss in several important industries and important parts of the advanced world. However, we find in our work that competition from China is not what's driving the patterns we see. Rather, looking at the adoption of robots is where we tend to get more action. So for instance, looking at just the advanced countries, we see that the more robots that you have per 1,000 members of your workforce, the fewer manufacturing workers you have as a share of the workforce. That's exactly the displacement effect that Jayla was referring to and that we all kind of carry around in our back pockets when we read the newspaper. What is the case for the developing countries? It's the reverse. Well, that's sort of mysterious. And we can shed a little bit of light on that mystery, looking at just a couple countries that help define that curve. And here we have Hungary, Mexico, and Slovenia. Now, what is special about those three countries? Well, they're all offshoring locations. That's to say that advanced countries are locating their plants in automobile plants or electronic instrument plants in those countries, and to do so they locate a modern 2020 plant that has robots in it, and then they also hire manufacturing workers to accompany those robots. So at present we're seeing this upward slope, that the more robots you have, the more manufacturing workers you have. So does that mean that everything is hunky-dory and that developing countries don't need to worry about anything? The answer is probably maybe, but maybe not. So far, this relative the balance between the displacement effect and the offshoring effect have been working in favor of developing countries. But we see some tentative signs from, for instance, Brazil and Mexico, that there's incipient polarization there. There is beginning to be some job loss in the manufacturing sector. And some of the papers we'll see later on in this panel will also present more subtle evidence from Mexico about the overall effect of robots. But at the end then, we really don't know over the long term what's the impact of the new technologies that are coming on. And the most we can say is that countries are going to need to have workforces that are prepared for the new technologies that arrive. They're going to have business climates, if you will, or contexts for doing business that are favorable to adoptions of new technologies. In short, that they're going to have to be, as Pascal said, prepared for what comes along. This is the unofficial motto of the World Bank Productivity Project. Actually, it's the official motto of the Productivity Project. I look forward to spending the rest of the morning, afternoon with you. Thank you.
So good morning. Our overarching question has been whether robots are coming for your job. And what I want to build on is that question, whether that's even the right question, matters enormously where you live. So we've been hearing about how in industrial countries that have large manufacturing base, this is of direct concern. But if we flip it and say, well, if you're living in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia, where the manufacturing sector isn't that big, industrialization hasn't really taken off, so you don't have that many manufacturing jobs and you have even fewer robots, is this then an irrelevant question? No, it is very much an important question, but it needs to be flipped around a little bit. So it isn't that robots are going to be replacing existing jobs. The question for many low-income countries is precisely if high-income countries are automating and putting in robots, does that mean a whole wave of jobs that low-income countries were hoping were coming to them will in fact not be coming? So what I want to talk about is whether or not the flying geese have been grounded. Okay, so why flying geese? So as Jayla had mentioned earlier, the sort of predominant paradigm of successful development over the last few decades has been that exhibited by East Asia. And it has been dubbed the flying geese model. And the idea was being able to move with a large labor force that's relatively low-skilled, low-wage, into these not so productive, low value-added, low-wage jobs, something like garments, that gave sort of an entry point. And as you became more productive, you could move up the value chain into more sophisticated kinds of goods, and wages would rise. This is good. This is what development is about. But it also means that those very low value-added jobs are no longer economically viable in an economy as wages are rising, so they move to the next set of countries that do have favorable conditions, including lower wages. And the process continues, right? They get more productive, their wages rise, and this low-skilled, low-wage production opportunities move to yet new countries. And the question now with the robots is sort of a bit twofold. So one of the countries that has benefited from this model enormously is China, and it's gone from being 5% of global manufacturing to 25%. And the country that is making the most robots, importing the most robots, installing the most robots is China. Right? So that's sort of one part of the question, but it's not just China that's automating. In terms of intensity, as we heard, it's even higher in South Korea, in Japan, in Germany, in Sweden, a whole set of countries. So then the question is it in fact that this kind of progressive moving into lower income countries is going to be grounded and not happening anymore, that one of these key pathways of development may in fact be narrowing? So what I want to do is start with a particular example. So these are Adidas speed factories, and they have two of them, one in Germany and one in the United States, making athletic footwear. And they're cutting edge, they're really cool, right? These started about 5 years ago to huge headlines. And the question was, if this was changing manufacturing, is this the future? One, in high-income countries. Two, completely automated, right? This is 3D printed soles and machines that sew and stitch on the top. And three, it sort of turns the manufacturing model upside down. Usually, why you can do this with low-cost wages is you're doing the same thing thousands of times. You get enormous economies of scale, and this is customized, right? They can take pictures of your feet to make a pair of shoes that fit you perfectly, right? So it was a complete reversal, and headlines of whether this was, therefore, the whole new change coming forward. Now, 3 months ago, they made the headlines again, because they're closing these factories in Germany and the United States, and they're opening them in Vietnam and China. So the point I want to make here is a twofold one. One, what matters is what's possible technologically. So they have shown you can fully automate 3D print shoes, customized, but the economics still matter. And while you can customize it, there's a lot of things in it, in fact, that are still standard, and doing it on a big mass production line makes sense. Being close to your suppliers, the distribution channels, the logistics matter, right? Okay, so then the question is, beautiful hype example, does this sort of one hand say, oh, it's all reshoring, oh, maybe we don't have to worry? Neither of those stories are correct. So what we wanted to do was go to the data and be able to look. So we've got 12 years of data looking across sectors and across high-income countries as they automate. What are they doing in terms of their forward-looking production decisions? So where are they investing? How much foreign direct investment into low-income countries are they doing? So first thing is there's enormous variation in how much automation there is across sectors. And part of this is technology, right? So on the left, you've got pictures of the garment sector. It's really hard to replace the human hand. We can handle all kinds of different kinds of fabrics much more easily than robots can. On the other hand, you've got things like automotives. It is the sector that is automating the most quickly. Cars are heavy to move around. high value added, and precision matters. So there's a lot of both technological and economic incentives as to why there's variation across sector. So if you take this variation across sectors and across countries, what do you see? If reshoring is really a predominant feature, you'd expect a negative relationship, that as high-income countries are automating, they're offshoring, doing less FDI. So we find three things. First is the positive story, right? The geese can still take off. What we find is a 10% increase in automation is associated with a 5.5% increase in offshoring, right? So this pathway is still going on. However, our second result is that it is a nonlinear effect. It is slowing down. So it is still positive, but beyond a certain threshold, as you automate more, the amount of offshoring is actually declining. And in a small subset, a little bit less than 5%, you actually do find that negative result, that there is some reshoring happening. So this means, from developing countries' perspective, this is still a pathway forward. There are opportunities. There are a whole set and different kinds of sectors where labor-intensive work is still possible. But the pathway is narrowing and the warning signs are there. So it is about human capital and skills. But if you can remember, right, that German factory going back to Vietnam and China, it was also about infrastructure that works, and logistics and distribution. So what it takes to be successful, that sort of bar is rising, but the bottom line is it's still possible. And so rather than the sort of alarmism of the question that we've highlighted, the overall event, take it as one of urgency, that there is things that can be done and really should be started to be tackled now. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, William and Mary, for that insightful perspective on what's coming of robots, what the coming of robots means for workers around the world. Also, fun fact, did you know that the cameras in this room are robot operated? Just so you know. So we'll now have a chance to drill down into your research with the questions from our audience as well as our moderator, Art Cray, who is the Director of Development Research Group at the World Bank. We received quite a few comments and questions like this one from Vish, who says the number of jobs will remain the same, but it is the quality of jobs that will change. So massive upskilling is key to succeed in the future. Thank you for your comment, Vish. With this in mind, Art, I'll let you take it away, and please keep those questions coming and comments using the hashtag robots and jobs. Over to you, Art.
Thank you very much, Zubi. It's great to be here with two colleagues from many years at the World Bank. The way they were introduced, they sound like a college, William and Mary. So I'd like to first of all set the record straight and point out that the gentleman on the right-hand side actually is Bill, and it's great to be here with Mary as well. It's also great to knowing that Mary is Canadian, that she shared with us a Canada goose, which is what that last visual was that we just lost. So I'd like to start out by asking you to imagine an engineer and an economist standing in a field of strawberries. Now, you might think that there's a joke coming and you're going to be disappointed, because it actually isn't a joke. And even if it were, you'd probably be disappointed with the punchline because it wouldn't be very good. But it's nevertheless useful to think about these two hypothetical people standing in a strawberry field, because it helps to illustrate how engineers and economists might think differently about automation. And if you'll indulge me for a minute, I'd like to sort of spin this out for a second, because I think it sets up then a number of questions that would be sort of very interesting to view through the lens of the two presentations that we just had. So an engineer standing in a strawberry field sort of looks at these strawberries and thinks, can I make a machine that will pick strawberries just as well as a person can? And when you think about it from that perspective, right, all the concerns, the title of this session, are robots coming for our jobs, seems extremely salient, right? Because you've got a technical problem. Can you make a machine that does the work that a person can do? And the strawberries one is actually a very interesting one, because automation of strawberry picking is viewed as one of these sort of really moonshot kind of technological challenges, because it's actually really, really difficult to do, and robotics engineers are making a lot of progress on it. Now, the economist who's standing there watching the engineer think about how to make a machine that can pick strawberries as well as a human can, sort of asking a different set of questions from the kind of technical questions that the engineer is asking herself. The economist is more likely to ask, well, if the engineer is successful in building a machine that picks strawberries as well as a person can, what's going to happen to the price of strawberries? And what's going to happen to the price of labor or the wage? And what's going to happen to the price of machines? And this is what economists call sort of thinking in general equilibrium. And the real advantage of doing that is that it helps you to see a lot further than the immediate potential displacement of one worker in one place by one particular machine. In fact, one of the things that the economist would start to think through, and particularly if they've read the sort of excellent research by people like Dorana Chimoglu and Restrepo, who have this wonderful paper called The Race Between Man and Machine, right? What you start thinking through is you realize that, well, there are these sort of self-regulating forces that are going to bring about balance between workers and machines. So the more machines you have picking strawberries, on the one hand, that is both going to reduce the price of strawberries because strawberries are going to be cheaper. It's also going to reduce the price of labor. And both of those are going to be forces that reduce the incentive to automate. And that's what, in the long run, is the sort of economic forces that are going to keep the balance between workers and machines. And that's why also I think thinking about this in terms of, you know, robots taking away everybody's jobs is going to be a very sort of narrow way to think about the question. But the other key thing that you get from thinking about problems like robots in general equilibrium is that you realize that it's not always going to be the same workers and they're the same people, and the jobs that are going to be created as a result of automation are not always going to be in the same places. And I think this is one thing that the two presentations we had saw just now were in common. So there might be offshoring from the US is creating jobs in Hungary and Slovenia, for example, in the example of Bill's slides, or in sort of disrupting this flying geese pattern. But once you start realizing that the jobs and the people are in different places, it raises questions about mobility, migration, training, and so on. And so what I thought I would do is sort of leave a little bit open and see if you wanted to say a little bit more, Mary, about how this sort of lens helps to think about the sort of policy implications of automation.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, I think you're bringing some really important points. So starting actually with the strawberries, I think this is something that's really an important point, that the price of goods can often go down fairly significantly. So there is sort of an output effect as well. And I think this is something that will come out in some of the other talks today, that some of these efficiency gains are helping the consumers of, in this case, strawberries. But it really can mean that while there may be some substitution of difference of how the ratio between the people and the machines, you also have this effect where, because what you're producing is a lot cheaper, there can be more demand for it. So you can have some increase in labor as well if that many more strawberries are being bought. Now, whether it's enough to offset that substitution between the people and the machines is an important question, and in many cases it won't necessarily be. But this story more broadly is an important one about development, and it is moving into more productive kinds of jobs and providing opportunities for those who have the kinds of skills that are still needed to be able to make these different kinds of goods. So being able to understand how things can be more efficient, how they can be offering new kinds of opportunities, and where is a very relevant set of issues. And really being able to have it where you can be producing more kinds of goods as demand's increasing, and really trying to give opportunities where often there haven't been the same for workers to be able to be productive and expand is a really critical part of this agenda.
Well, and I want to turn to you too, Bill, to draw you out a little bit more on the quote at the end: "The fortune favors the prepared." The previous version of that, of course, is that fortune favors the brave, which may actually be relevant when you think about the courage that it takes for people to move across sectors and move to different places and to acquire new skills. Do you want to say a little bit more about the implications for mobility and training that come from this view of different jobs moving to different places in response to automation?
Yeah, I was going to move from strawberries to corn. I taught for a while at the University of Illinois in Urbana, and Central Illinois was well, let's put it, 90% of Illinois employment in 1900 was in agriculture. It wasn't displaced by robots, but it was displaced by technology in general, and right now 4% of the Illinois workforce is in agriculture. Now, it's as Art said, other sectors emerged. However, it did displace a lot of people, and it required a whole new set of skills to participate in the new economy that was emerging, which was more of a manufacturing economy. I think that could be happening now. The chances are that in the industrialized world, we're going to continue to lose manufacturing jobs. We've been losing them for actually more than since 1990. You can look at the rate of employment and it's falling. But if the jobs that emerge are violin teachers, I don't want to say baristas. I'm not sure about the long-run career prospects of that, but there are many new jobs which, in the same way that jobs didn't exist in 1900 and now exist, that may exist in the future. So it's exactly as Art was saying. There's going to be a lot of movement of people, a lot of retraining, a lot of churning, and we have to have the social protection mechanisms in place to make that as smooth as possible. But it's not obviously the case that we're entering an entirely new world.
I think an interesting perspective on that is that, at the turn of the 20th century, economists who were looking ahead and seeing technologies like cars developing were worried about, what is going to be the effect on horses? Right? And so there was this sort of clear technological substitution. But, and again, I'm going to borrow a line from the Acemoglu and Restrepo paper, which allude to this in their introduction. This is the key thing that a lot of people in those discussions missed, is that people and horses are very, very different. Right? Because you can't use a horse for different skills. You can't teach a horse new skills. You can't teach a horse a new trade. Whereas people are infinitely sort of adaptable and flexible and able to sort of move into new and different areas. And so the challenge, of course, for policy is to make this possible. Let me toss a different and perhaps harder question to both of you to think about in the couple of minutes that we have left. And that is that when you think about the sort of countries that we've named in this discussion, so we're talking about robots in the United States. I'm not quite sure that we put Hungary and Slovenia in the developing country bucket as you did on your graph, and maybe you're talking a little bit about Vietnam and China and Thailand. But I think an interesting question for a place like the World Bank that really is focused on poverty in some of the poorest, most difficult places in the world is, what's the relevance of these kind of stories when you start thinking about development challenges in sub-Saharan Africa, and in particularly very difficult places, the Sudans and the DRCs? How do we think about robots in that context?
So I think one thing that's important, so far we've been talking really about manufacturing and therefore literal physical robots. For some countries in sub-Saharan Africa that really aren't very active in manufacturing, a sort of a flip is other kinds of digital software or AI or even phones, which are sort of a different kind in some sense of robot. But I think it actually offers a really important insight. When we talk about skilling and needing new skills and new jobs, people will need to move to do different things. And a lot of times the emphasis is on the creation of robots or software or apps, which is skilled. And the question for a lot of Africa is not whether or not, that they can have people that are programmers, excellent. What about the users and whether this is actually increasing their productivity? And here I think we're really trying to sort of focus and understand what the opportunities for the users, right? So the ones who are using the robots or using this new technology, their productivity goes up. Their possibility to earn is increasing, right? So there are concerns of people who may be displaced or never hired, but the ones who are working with this new technology, their productivity is definitely increasing. And a lot of the technology isn't necessarily that skilled to be able to use it, to get SMS text messages to know what the price of goods are and where between different markets you'll get a better return, or to get information from satellites as to when to plant, fertilize, harvest, can massively increase the returns to subsistence farmers without needing a whole lot of skills. So I think it's an opportunity to differentiate different kinds of technologies, different kind of skills, and to recognize there are actually huge opportunities in very basic skills where new technology can reinforce and actually help raise the income and productivity of low-skilled workers.
Last word to you, Bill.
But if I can just be a little bit of a downer, traditionally this the mechanization that's gone on has displaced a certain kind of human skill, but required a different skill to complement the weaving loom or whatever new technology is coming along. What we've got right now are robots whose prices are falling really rapidly and whose capabilities are increasing a lot. So now to be the complementary labor for a robot is going to require much more in terms of skill, in terms of creativity, in terms of able to think in a non-rote way. And for the countries you're talking about, the question is, can we get their human capital up to the level where they can actually be players with these new technologies? Or are they just going to be left out of the flying geese pattern?
Thanks very much, Bill and Mary. I'll turn back over to Zubi to introduce the next session.
Thank you, Art. Thank you, Art, William, and Mary. Folks, please hang around. We have so much coming up. Keep your comments and questions as well coming on Twitter using the hashtag robotsandjobs or in the comments on our World Bank live feed. Up next are two more riveting talks by Bob Rikers, who is the Senior Economist for Trade and Integration at the World Bank, and Hanan Winkler, who is the Senior Economist for Human Development at the World Bank. Their researches explore whether automation in rich countries hurts developing countries. Now, last week, we shared another question online asking, in which of the following sectors have robots been used most widely? Over 1,000 people tested their knowledge, and over 80% of those chose the correct answer. And this is the automotive sector. Bob, Hanan, tell us more what's happening in these sectors and other broad trends that you're seeing both here in the US and globally.
Thank you very much. So we're all here today because robots are being adopted on a progressively larger scale. And that trend is projected to continue into the near future, with the International Federation of Robotics projecting robot adoption to grow by more than 10% each year for the foreseeable future. And this has evoked concerns that perhaps this is bad news for developing countries and that the export-led development model may be dead, because rather than relying on offshoring and foreign labor, industrial robots make it feasible to relocate production closer to home. But is this true? Well, when we study the impact automation has already had on inter-industry trade between rich countries in the north that have been the primary adopters of robots until relatively recently, and developing countries in the global south, what we see is that rather than crippling trade, automation seems to have catalyzed it. So increased adoption of robots in sectors like the automotive industry, the metal industry in the north, has been associated with a surge in exports from those countries to developing countries, fueled by increases in productivity. Surprisingly, it has also been associated with an increase in their imports from developing countries. And that increase in imports has been concentrated primarily in intermediate inputs. And the reason is quite obvious when you think about it, and Art already alluded to this. If you're assembling a car using a robot, this is going to make you more productive. This is going to allow you to reduce the price of that car, which is going to enable you to produce more cars. But if you're producing more cars, you're probably also going to need more tires, more wires, more engines, more brakes. And as long as you're not producing all those parts in your own country, you're likely to import some from other countries, and that's going to lead to a surge in the demand for goods from developing countries. And that's exactly what we're seeing in industries like the automotive industry, the metal industry, etc. And this phenomenon of innovation-induced trade isn't just confined to industrial robots. We've also seen it in the hearing aids industry, which in 2007 shifted almost entirely to 3D printing. And that's exactly when we see trade in hearing aids surge, as a recent paper by Carolyn Freund and co-authors documents. But of course, this doesn't mean that nothing is changing, because the skills that are now required to compete in this global economy are arguably very different from the skills that were traditionally important. So to conclude, the export-led development model is not dead. Innovation and automation are presenting new opportunities for developing countries, but harnessing them is going to likely require significant investments in human capital and social protection policies. And I'll now hand over to my colleague, Hernan Winkler.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So when we walk into the Ministry of Labor in most developing countries to talk about jobs, we hear two types of concerns typically. One is we want good jobs. We want our people to use new technologies, to earn higher wages, to produce a type of goods and services that we can sell to rich economies. This makes total sense. But often during the same conversation, we hear, but we're worried. How can we prevent, if we get these good jobs, how can we make sure that we are never going to lose into further technological developments to automation? So the question is, can you have it both ways? Can you have good techie jobs and never be worried about losing them to our automation? This is what brought us together to work on this paper about Mexico. Why Mexico? Mexico is a great example because it's a developing country that is automating rapidly, especially in the car sector, as we heard today. In some car companies in Mexico, you may find a level of automation that is not so different from what you would expect at an American car company in terms of robots per worker. And also you have a great setting. You have Mexico, the US next to each other, very different levels of development, but highly integrated. What happens in the US matters a lot for some Mexican communities that are very specialized in some services and products that the US is automating rapidly. So there is a concern in these Mexican communities that more automation in the US can imply fewer exports, fewer jobs, fewer opportunities for Mexican workers in these remote communities. How do we do it? In simple terms, we rank Mexican districts in terms of their exposure to automation. Here in this map, you see in darker areas, those in darker colors, those areas that may produce, let's say, machinery, which is export machinery to the US, which is a sector that the US is automating rapidly. And those districts may face a higher risk of losing export markets than those lighter areas that maybe export more furniture to the US, which is a sector that the US is automating less rapidly. And in even lighter colors, we have some districts that they do not export at all to the US. So the exposure to automation in the US is very minimal. And we do the same for exposure to domestic automation. Here, we have in dark areas some districts in Mexico, maybe where more workers are in the plastics industry. So these districts face a higher risk maybe of layoffs if there is more automation in the plastics industry, as opposed to some districts where maybe most workers are in the mezcal industry, where that is produced with a very ancient production method. The risk of automation is much lower. And then we correlate these measures of exposure with measures of export growth and employment growth. What do we find? We find evidence consistent with automation in the US hurting Mexican exports to the US. Now, when we look into the labor market impacts of this, we do not find any associated impacts on workers. We can discuss this more later. But Mexico may have to be more worried about automation in their own backyard than automation in the US, since we find that automation in Mexico is already affecting Mexican workers. Those areas that are more exposed to domestic automation saw larger declines in salaried employment. Interestingly, these displaced workers do not move to unemployment. They move to take a job, an informal job, as a self-employed, as an unpaid family worker, as a seasonal worker. It's not the quantity, but the quality of jobs that declines. And as you may expect, unskilled workers are affected the most. And as a result, wage inequality at the local level declines. There is a unicorn in this story, which is the car sector, which I hope we can discuss later. So the main messages are these. Automation in the US is affecting Mexican exports to the US. Workers not yet affected. Automation in Mexico is already having a negative impact on Mexican workers, and there is a unicorn in the story. So where do we go from here? Next time we go to the Ministry of Labor of a developing country, it's important to remember that technology has a host of positive benefits. It can contribute to economic growth, to create good, productive jobs. And in developing countries, it's not the threat of robots, it's rather the lack of capacity to absorb new technologies that is the main bottleneck. There is a lack of skills many times. There is a lack of a competitive environment. And to end with the question posed at the beginning is, can we have it both ways? Can we have good techie jobs and never be worried about automation? And here we have to remember that access to technology is the same as maybe access to international trade, international finance. These are good things that they come with risks. Some workers will be subject to the ups and downs of technology, and it is important to provide a safety net for these workers. We are talking about good social protection systems, training options, lifelong learning systems. This type of policies today may be more important than ever before. Thank you.
Bob and Hanan, I think the point you made about the effects on Mexico was a particularly striking fact related to this trend. And now let's dig deep into this research with our moderator, Carolyn Freund, who is the Global Director for Trade, Investment and Competitiveness at the World Bank. Please, if you have a question for our experts, share with us using the hashtag robots and jobs or by commenting on the World Bank Live page. And now I'll pass it over to you, Carolyn.
Great, thank you so much. You know, it's interesting listening to the two talks next to each other because in some sense, and Hernan, I think you're a little bit of an outlier relative to Bill's presentation as well, in that you're kind of a techno-pessimist, in that the robots actually might be coming for our jobs, and we see that with rising automation in the US, Mexican exports are going down, though actually we don't find a jobs effect. Bob, on the other hand, finds this positive kind of scale and productivity effect, similar maybe to the Industrial Revolution, where you have a huge increase in technology, productivity, scale increases, prices go down, people want more, you need more intermediate inputs. So two kind of different effects. So I guess I'm going to start with you, Hernan, and ask, so why do you think that your results are different from both the chart Bill showed us, where we saw more automation and more manufacturing, which I guess refers more to the Mexican side, as well as to Bob's, which has the US pull side. So on both, you're finding more negativity. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's a lot to do with a very particular case of Mexico and the US. These are two bordering countries. More than 80% of exports from Mexico go to the US. So it matters a lot that they're highly connected. So maybe it's capturing a lot of these very specific effects rather than Bob's paper where he considers more countries. So I think it may have to do a lot with that.
And how about on the jobs question? So why do you think it is that you don't find an effect on jobs for the decline in exports to the US?
Right, so we have different theories on that. One is that unlike domestic automation, where you see a direct effect, you have a Mexican factory getting a robot that has a direct implication for a Mexican worker. Here is through trade. You have an intermediate effect channel here. And maybe it could be the fact that labor costs in Mexico are lower. So maybe still, even though the US is automating in Mexico, it still is able to be competitive with workers. They don't need to adopt robots or lay off workers. That could be one alternative. And it's also just, it's not a direct channel like domestic automation.
Great, thank you. Bob, so feel free to also comment on why you think your results might be different. But one question I wanted to ask you is about whether we can think about the results on these types of technologies, and there any implications for other new technologies that are being adopted, such as artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence might be different because it's more about how you structure production, what you produce, making sure you're sending things to the right places. Do you think that will have similar effects? Are there anything we can learn from this to think about how the adoption of those technologies might affect trade and employment?
So thanks for this question. It's an excellent question. I would argue that sort of the basic mechanisms that sort of we're documenting will still be at play. But one aspect of industrial robots that's perhaps unique is that they're extremely labor replacing. So the displacement effect that we see with robots, I think is pretty extreme. I don't think we see this sort of with other forms of capital. So if you think, for instance, about the ICT revolution or the advent of the internet, I think there we see stronger complementarities between labor and capital, which is going to mitigate some of these immediate displacement effects. Yet at the same time, I think when production is organized in global value chains, it's pretty obvious that in general equilibrium, when you sort of innovate in one segment of that chain, that's going to increase the productivity and by implication the demand for other parts of the chain and make them more valuable. So I think those mechanisms will still be very much at play and continue to be very important.
So what makes countries adopt robots? So what is the force at work that leads countries to start adopting? So we heard Korea's a big adopter, China's a big adopter. What makes them adopt more than other countries? And is there a price of robots where all the results we're talking about sort of can be turned on their heads?
So I would say there are two factors that drive robot adoption: economics and engineering. Economics, because we see that there's more robot adoption in countries that pay high wages and where the labor force is aging. So we see a lot of labor-saving technologies being invented and being adopted in countries that are grappling with aging populations. We also see that sort of the feasibility of automation varies a lot across sectors, as Mary already alluded to. And there seems to be certain tasks that are much easier to imitate and perform using a robot than others. For instance, giving someone a haircut is actually surprisingly difficult to do using a robot. So I think it's the combination of sort of technology and economics that governs adoption. One sort of, I think, interesting implication of thinking about the problem in this way is that if the price of robots falls to effectively zero and all tasks that can be performed by robots are in fact performed by robots, then sort of further improvements in the productivity of robots are going to be purely complementing labor and actually drive up the demand for human labor.
You know, as we're talking about robots, one topic that hasn't come up that they really do affect is inequality. So in the sense that if robots or capital in general is getting a larger share of GDP, that means labor's getting less. So how should we think about the adoption of robots in a world where in many countries we're concerned with rising inequality? And at the same time, if we think robots might at some point start taking jobs, and we tend to tax labor, should we be taxing robots? How should we think about robots and concerns over inequality? Why don't I start with you, Erna?
Yeah, so I think in developing countries is a different issue because the barriers to adopting technologies are so high. And it's true that robots, unlike previous technological revolutions. If we think about when the car factory, the Ford factory started, I mean, it was different. That benefited a lot of manual workers that were able to send their kids to college with those jobs. Now that's different. I mean, now we have these new technologies that tend to benefit those who are better off, who are better prepared, and it's something to keep in mind. I mean, that's what we find, and it's important for governments to protect those workers, to equip them with the right skills to keep up in the race. I mean, so I think we should always try to lift the bottom up and to keep up with those who are already better prepared to benefit of this.
So skills, not taxes.
Definitely with skills.
And Bob, anything to add on that?
I think it would seem natural to think about sort of the balance between taxing capital and taxing labor. If we're really concerned about inequality. And so it does seem indeed a bit odd that we're taxing labor so heavily. And I think these concerns about inequality are exacerbated by the fact that multinationals are becoming increasingly important, and it can be the case that sort of the capitalists that own robots are not even residents of the countries in which they are deployed. So I think these concerns are very legitimate.
So the car industry, we haven't talked about the car industry yet, and I think Bob had this nice chart showing that it's both the industry that's most automated as well as the one that is in some sense most intricately engaged in global value chains, importing a lot of inputs from other countries. And you said the car industry is a unicorn. So what's so special about cars? And it is a big part of trade. And are there implications for any other industries?
So yeah, I mentioned that because when we first started working on this paper, we thought, okay, this may be a whole industry about the car sector, since it's an outlier. Most of the robots are in the car industry in Mexico and in the US. I'm happy to see Bill's chart where he also showed that Mexico is a country where there is a lot of automation and also many manufacturing jobs. So this is a test that we did. We saw, okay, let's split the Mexican communities among those who produce cars and those who do not produce cars. And we actually find that the larger negative impacts are among those who do not produce cars, which was very informative to us. I mean, so it's automation in the other industries that is more labor replacing. And we think that this maybe has to do on how the type of integration global value chains that Mexico has with the US, where they tend to adopt robots to be more integrated to the US, to produce more, to become more efficient. And maybe that is what makes the labor demand stronger. And that's maybe something that may happen as other industries in developing countries start adopting more technologies.
Bob, any thoughts about the auto industry?
Just to complement this, or this, in fact, what we've seen in the US is that employment in the US car industry has gone up, while it also has adopted more and more robots. But the types of jobs that are being created are ones that are highly complementary to sort of robots. So it's programmers, it's engineers, it's not your typical manual labor that's benefiting from this increased adoption of robots.
Very, very good. I want to give the audience a chance in case there are any questions out there. Is there any burning questions or questions from online? Great, thank you. Let's see. So an online question. Is Bob's finding on the increased possibility of producing and exporting intermediate goods at all relevant for least developed countries that have experienced almost no industrialization? So are these results useful when we look at some of the countries in Africa or South Asia where there's very little industrialization or even deindustrialization now?
Yes. I think that's a great question. I think one thing that sort of perhaps I didn't emphasize sufficiently is that sort of these results we document sort of are about average effects. But of course, if you are not already interlinked into the global economy, if you're not part of global value chains, or if you're directly competing with producers in rich countries that are adopting these robots on a wide scale, then you are actually likely to lose out. So I think it sort of further highlights how important it is to be interlinked into the global economy. But I do think it may make it harder for you to do so because the global economy is becoming more competitive. So we're not saying that there are only winners from robots. No, some countries definitely stand to lose, and some may even lose a lot.
So I guess this is a really important question and one we're often asked. And Mary brought this up in her presentation with the flying geese, is there still room for industrialization in these countries? So is it the case that it's so much harder that now they should skip the manufacturing phase and go directly to services? Or is there still a path to development through industrialization and manufacturing for countries that haven't been involved in it? And one fact I'd like to point out is that if you look at the share of labor in manufacturing, while in industrial countries it tends to be falling, when China it's risen, if we look at it overall, it's actually flat. So despite automation, if automation was really reducing labor, we think it would be declining. If there was a lot of outsourcing to low-cost labor that's less productive, it might be rising, but it's actually been flat over time. So could that be a positive message? So last words, is there still a role for manufacturing in countries that haven't really started on that path?
So I think as the type of manufacturing is also changing. While we think about manufacturing many years ago, it's not the same now. Now we have many industries that are a mix of manufacturing and services. Sometimes it's difficult to draw the line. It's true, as you said, that the trends in the long term is either manufacturing is stagnant or declining. But I think what we have to care more about is to create good jobs. I mean, whether they be in manufacturing or in services, I think that should be our main goal right now.
I would argue most definitely yes. There are, I think, many opportunities to integrate into global value chains, but perhaps it's also important to be realistic about sort of exactly which segment of the value chain like countries can aspire to compete in.
Great. Please join me in thanking Hernan and Bob for two interesting presentations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn, Bob, and Hernan. And now for some questions and comments from our online audience. It's mostly comments, like one it's on Facebook from Andrea Hajaz, who says, no, robots are not coming for our jobs. There will be jobs disappearing due to robotization, automation, and there'll be new jobs created and new skills required. While Abe Mlongo says, I support robots, automation when it comes to dangerous workplace conditions, lifting heavy material and hazardous work environment. Another one from LinkedIn from a gentleman called Nathan Ramadan, who is the country planning manager at Shell Indonesia, says, it seems that we see this worry appear with every industrial revolution. Maybe thousands of jobs will disappear and get replaced by AI, yet many more new jobs will appear. Recall the Luddites of the 1900s who opposed mechanization in the textile industry. Yet around the same period, we see the boom of steam engines, smelters, and telegraphs, which generated lots of economic growth, resulting in more jobs. He goes on to say, a couple of decades ago, we never would have considered social media manager or fintech consultant, I kind of feel seen here, as real jobs, but here we are. Rather than worrying about being replaced, channel that energy to upskilling yourself so as not to be obsolete. Thank you so much to all these questions. Please keep them coming using the hashtag #robotsandjobs. And now, folks, we are going into the second part of this event. And until now, you've heard from World Bank researchers. Now you'll hear from private sector practitioners and an academic. All of them have deep experience with the effects of automation and robots on advanced and developing country workforces. My colleague Noriana Fernando will introduce our eminent speakers and moderate the discussion. Take it away, Noriana.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. It is my pleasure to be guiding you through the next 45 minutes of what I promise will be a fascinating discussion, if it's anything like what we just saw in the green room. So, again, welcome to you all. I know we have a few hundred people joined online. A warm welcome to you as well. We want your questions, we want your disagreements, so keep them coming. We'll be taking them throughout the course of this panel. So without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker, Amy Wright, Managing Partner for Talent and Transformation at IBM. Let's give her a round of applause. So Amy is responsible for bringing innovative services and software to IBM clients to help with transformation of talent and reinvention of the HR function. We're pleased to have you here today, Amy. Next up is Susan Lund, Partner at McKinsey & Company. One of Susan's research focuses includes the effects of automation and AI on the future of work and workforce skills. You're definitely on the right panel here, Susan. And next up, we have Rob Atkinson, founder and president of IT and Innovation Foundation, where he leads a team of policy analysts who are shaping the debate on critical issues at the intersection of public policy and technology. Let's give him a round of applause. And finally, coming to us all the way from Philadelphia at the Wharton School of Business is Lynn Boo, Assistant Professor of Operations, Information, and Decisions. Lynn's research focus is on how emerging IT and artificial intelligence affect innovation, business strategy, and productivity. We really have all lenses, all sides of the coin here today, and we are so honored to have you here. So we've heard a lot this morning about how automation and robots have affected and changed developed countries, but the verdict in developing countries is a little mixed. For example, in Sri Lanka, where I'm from, you look at the plantation sector, where automation's coming to the rescue. There is a shortage of labor supply, changing youth aspirations, automation's helping them out. But then you look at the logistics sector, which is at the core of export strategy, and smart solutions, smart management solutions are likely to displace countless jobs in the future. So it's really a mixed impact. I'd like to have start with a lightning round for our panelists of what are you seeing on the ground? What's keeping people up at night in countries that you're working in?
Shall I start? So in today's age in which businesses are really dramatically being disrupted. So we have organizations like healthcare providers starting to become financial institutions. We have retailers becoming healthcare providers, and we have financial institutions moving to digital. So entire businesses are being disrupted, which means entire businesses need new types of skills. So if you look at developing versus advanced countries, it really provides a lot of challenges plus a lot of opportunities, because right now things are changing so dramatically that things haven't been kind of set in stone yet on what kind of skills are going to come from which countries. And one thing is for sure, there are gaps in every single country.
I'd say, as an economist, look, we know in the long run from past technological revolutions that there will be new jobs created. Employment will find an equilibrium. But we also know that there can be a lot of disruption in the transition. So when you look at the first industrial revolution, Britain went through a nearly 50-year period where productivity was rising and wages weren't. So what I worry about in the coming years, particularly in developing and low-income countries, are what's going to happen with wages, how will technology impact service jobs that have been the source of a lot of job creation, although they need more. And I also think that as we think about global supply chains, we need to think beyond technology and look at other factors that companies are considering. And I'll say more about all of that in the next round.
So I think there's a lot of confusion about this issue. I'd actually argue we're in a period of unprecedented lack of change. Things aren't changing all that fast, which they were. Global productivity growth is at its slowest rate ever. U.S. productivity growth is at the slowest rate ever. That's not evidence of a big, massive technological revolution. If there was one, we would see that in productivity growth. So I think the risk is not that we're going to have too much productivity growth from technology and automation and not enough jobs. There's a, again, a report we wrote a number of years ago called "Robots, Do They Make or Take Jobs?" The answer is no, they don't make or take jobs. at a macro level. But we reviewed the literature. The literature is 100%. There's not a single study that shows that when you have high rates of productivity, you have somehow lower job growth or higher unemployment. There's a good ILO study from 2004 that found strong support for simultaneous growth in productivity and unemployment in the medium term. I don't think that's going to change. Nor do I worry about income inequality. And I know that the sort of dominant view of the UK and the Industrial Revolution is what Susan said, but there's a number of new studies that have just come out in the last couple of years that look at this in a very great detail. And what they find is actually there wasn't very much productivity in the Industrial Revolution for a lot of other reasons. You had famines, you had all these other factors, and it really wasn't until the 1830s that you started to get productivity growth, and that's when wages grew. So I think the risk for developing countries and emerging economies is actually just the opposite. It's that they're not going to get robots because wages are so low. You don't install robots unless you have medium to high wages because they don't pay off very well. So I think the risk is much more about stagnation than it is going to be about massive robotization.
It's almost like a perfect follow on what I'm going to say is that there actually is a productivity or innovation paradox. We do see a rising investment in artificial intelligence, technology, especially automation-related technology. And yet, if you look at the innovation statistics, the multi-factor productivity growth, and also as a patent as well as the scientific paper output, we see the rate of increase actually decreasing over time while technology is increasing over time. So this mirrors the paradox that Bob Solow that mentioned over 30 years ago about IT revolution, that we see IT everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So we use the lesson we learned from that paradox to project on the AI or robot paradox. We may actually see very similar pattern. We may see a stagnation in the beginning, but then a rapid productivity growth afterward, after firms realize how to best leverage technologies such as robots, such as artificial intelligence. And that reconfiguration of work practices and reconfiguring or engineering processes at work, that's going to be, in my opinion, the most important part of this debate. So we have seen already in our analysis that firms that reconfigure their innovation practice in a certain way benefit tremendously from big data, from robots, while the firm that wasn't are not. And one of the examples is decentralized or dispersed innovation practices. So I think as these technologies become more widely adopted, widely used, we'll learn lots about firm practices, or best practices that complement these technologies. And in my opinion, it's not about jobs being displaced. It's new jobs, new tasks, and new practices that are associated with that being reinvented as a result of this. And I agree that perhaps the speed at this time is a little faster, but I think we are. But I'm also seeing lots of emerging firm practices that can effectively leverage these technologies.
Thank you all very much. It's an interesting way to look at this, disruption versus stagnation, and arguably stagnation is a disruption in itself. So more from the disruption point of view, how do we prepare for this? Amy, I'd like to turn to you and quote a recent IBM survey it's kind of alarming. It's really at our doorstep because it found that 120 million workers globally will need retraining in the next 3 years because of the impact of AI on jobs. And in fact, something that used to take 3 days to prepare for is now going to take 36 days, and some skills can even take years to develop. What is your advice to developing countries, Amy, given this backdrop and given your experience? In fact, we have a question coming in from online. What skills will human workers need to work peacefully alongside the robots?
Great, thank you. So first of all, this study we did, we interviewed thousands of C-level executives from across the globe. And the results of that, first of all, I thought were pretty astounding. It said that CEOs are now ranking skills as the #1 priority investment area for them in order to make their business objectives work. And that only 41% of them believe that they have the right skills today to achieve their business objectives. So that's a pretty alarming dichotomy right there. But in this survey and some other skills work we've done, it's become evident that the half-life of skills is declining pretty dramatically. So that means that the number of new skills you need to learn in your life increases pretty dramatically. But the reason for that is that the types of skills where those gaps are have changed. So in 2016, the top skill gaps were technology skills. Today, the top 5 skill gaps are actually not technology skills anymore. They are behavioral skills. They're skills like flexibility, adaptability, ability to work in teams well, time management because of the infusion of all kinds of different technologies and things that divert our attention. So really different ways of working that are required for us to work together. Some of that is locally, but also working with virtual teams. So the same time that the half-life of skills is creating a challenge for us, also we're dealing with the fact that the types of skills individuals need to learn is different than it used to be. Now, technical skills are still important, but they are now down at number 6 and 8 in terms of prioritization. So again, still important, but we've started to make some progress in those technology skills, and now the key skills are behavioral. So what do we do about it? And one of the things that's really interesting about this is, so we've been taught, our organizations have been taught, and through years and decades of working on how we work together and how we use technology and how we work together in an organizational model. And now that's being challenged in a different way. Again, virtual working in teams in a different way in which organizational boundaries come down as we focus on employee experience and customer experience. That requires us to work across these organizational boundaries that workers haven't had to do in the past. So these new ways of working and new cultures are creating different approaches that corporations and really locally teams need to take. So again, what do we do about it? We all have this responsibility, and this is really at a different point in time now than it was several years ago. Organizations are adopting and individuals are adopting a continuous learning approach because these skills that are changing so frequently, we all have to be able to and be prepared to learn new skills all the time. And we need to do it not only as our own responsibility as individuals, but corporations have a different responsibility now with their employees to bring them along and for us to learn together. And we have responsibilities as individuals, as local community members, and as corporations to build the skills up locally in whatever country you're in. So there are no, as I mentioned earlier, there's not one country in the world in which there are enough of the right kinds of skills. So together it's requiring different types of programs and different types of approaches to be able to build these skills together. One of those programs that we're very visible in is a program called P-TECH. And P-TECH is an approach in which we team with over 200 schools now around the globe in over 20 different countries in order to develop those capabilities for individuals that didn't get an opportunity to go to have an advanced degree. And so developing those kinds of capabilities and bringing them along and actually forming specific roles for them where they can be the most innovative employees that we have. And that's actually the case. When the was developed a few years ago, we actually have some wonderful new workers that have come into the workplace, are operating in a very different way, and are innovating in very different and creative ways than we ever had in the past. So I feel very good about the opportunity to develop skills, but we're going to have to do this together. It's not just going to happen naturally. We have to purposefully build skills together.
Thank you so much, Amy. I think this is a really important message for any policymakers in the audience as to decide where to invest. And we know that skills like socio-emotional skills, those start from the very early days. So investing in human capital, it's a holistic project. Thank you. So Susan, I'd like to turn to you now. We heard about the flying geese pattern today, where new technologies have facilitated offshoring of jobs to developing countries. Developing countries have progressively passed down their lower skilled jobs to lower income countries coming after them. But this effect is in danger of not playing out as robots become cheaper. Is that what you're seeing happening on the ground? What's your take on it?
Thanks so much for having me. I'd first like to say, look, I agree with everything Mary Hallward-Dreyer has found on this topic. I think she got it right. I will add a couple of thoughts for those of you particularly joining online out in various country offices. I think that in addition to just thinking about will robots replace jobs, companies are thinking holistically about their supply chains along several different dimensions. They're thinking about what you need to make robots work, so the infrastructure, the power supply, the skilled labor force. But we do see examples around the world, in Vietnam and Ethiopia, of manufacturing facilities that have started to adopt automation and robotics. And what they've found is that their workforce has grown. Labor productivity has soared, but because the quality is better and prices are sometimes lower, demand has surged. And so overall, they're employing more people to work alongside the machines, even though labor productivity has gone up even more. So that's sort of the positive story. But if I was sitting in a low-income country right now, there are a couple other things that worry me. One is just a shift in consumer demand and the issue of speed to market. So for any kind of consumer good in textiles, fashion, there's been a huge shift that's been underway, where companies can't really predict consumer demand as well as they could because of social media. Suddenly, what people want to buy depends on what Meghan Markle wore or Kim Kardashian wore, and suddenly one item will fly off the shelves. They used to be able to pretty much predict what you were going to want to buy because it's what they advertised, but they don't control advertised in our online social media driven world. So that means that being able to respond to that shift in consumer demand very quickly and get goods into stores is paramount. And this is why, although Nike shut down its speed factory in Atlanta and Germany, Adidas did, Nike has its Flyknit factory, which again is completely automated, in Mexico, because it can ship to anywhere in the US very quickly. It's why Zara does all of its production in Spain and Portugal. It can get an item from the design stage to a store in Manhattan in 25 days. So speed to market favors being closer, if not in the country where you're selling, at least closer. That's one concern. I would say a second concern is the green economy and the green supply chains. There's starting to be a lot of focus on the carbon emissions of the textile and apparel industry, and the chemical, the water usage, all the environmental damage. I have 2 teenage daughters, and they won't go to stores and buy new clothes. Everything has to be used, resale. It's the circular economy. And this is going to be another impact. So I think if I was sitting in a low-income country, I would be thinking very hard about how can you play into that greening of supply chains. Clearly, having to ship goods halfway around the world is not a positive thing for carbon emissions. So I think companies are considering a lot of different factors. Technology is only one of them. But there are shifts underway. Secondly, I would say consider the impact of technology on service jobs. Business process offshoring has been a huge success in some countries, like Costa Rica, the Philippines, India. A lot of that basic BPO call center work is very highly automatable by what we call a virtual assistant. So the companies that have adopted these automated virtual assistants find after the AI is up and has learned the job, can sometimes handle 60 to 65% of calls without any human interaction. Now, there will still be some humans in call centers, but they're going to have to do the much more complex troubleshooting. So again, demand for skills. Look at banking. We heard earlier, yes, the automated teller machine did not replace bank tellers in the US. Instead of doling out cash, they started to sell you credit cards and mortgages and these things. But now the advent of mobile banking is swamping bank tellers, and they're actually now being put out of business. So it's maybe the pervasiveness of different technologies. So a technology that just did one machine, take deposits, hand out cash, did not threaten the number of bank tellers. But now that we've had another consumer demand shift towards the convenience and flexibility of doing all your banking online through your phone, that is decimating the bricks and mortar bank employees. So in developing countries, when you think about, well, what have been large sources of service job growth, it's been retail and it's been financial services. And I would wonder, maybe will those jobs actually appear? It's not not that they will be replaced, but will they be there if you go immediately to mobile banking? Or like China, if you see a huge takeoff in e-commerce rather than bricks and mortar stores. So I would pay attention to what's happening in the service sector as well. But then finally, I will end on a note of optimism because I am an inherently optimistic person, despite being an economist. And that's what kind of opportunity will digital and mobile technologies have to unleash productivity of small businesses? So with digital payments, already we can see a revolution in the ease and efficiency with which small vendors and small businesses can collect payments. With that, there's a great startup, iZettle. It was bought by PayPal, but it's layered on a technology to keep track of what's being sold in a store, who's buying it, so that you can reorder more efficiently. Then you can start to do very simple marketing analysis. You can figure out shampoo sells on Monday or maybe Friday, and you can see which customers buy the most. And so you can start to do the kind of understanding your customer analytics just through mobile apps that it took large companies hundreds of millions of dollars of enterprise software development that was customized can now just be done on an app. So maybe that will unleash a new age of productivity and opportunity for small businesses. And that's where I'd love to see some optimism.
Thank you so much. And I'm hearing again this theme of being prepared. Fortune indeed favors the prepared. To find out when someone's buying shampoo, the customer analytics is going to take a lot of training. So Rob, over to you. Your research has also landed a little more on the optimistic side of the skies. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So, I was in India a couple of years ago speaking at some CEO conference, and I love India. It was in Goa. I was on the beach, listening to the Beach Boys fake group and drinking. I'm talking to the CEO of a pretty major Indian company, and I was talking to him about how, my week in India, all I saw was unbelievable levels of inefficiency. Feather bedding. I was in one building in Delhi. No, I guess in Mumbai. And we get in the elevator, and it's really crowded. And we get all the way to the top. And I realize there's a guy in the elevator paid to push the buttons. Like, really? And so there's this massive overstaffing in India. And I said to him, how are you ever going to raise your productivity in India? He said, Rob, we can't afford productivity in India. We need the jobs. And to me, what is the single biggest, how do you know you're a developing country? All these things. It's pretty simple. You have a low income. If you have a low income, you're a developing country. If you have a high income, you're a developed country. And so the single most important thing for a developing country, nothing else matters except raising productivity. That's why people want to get rich or middle class. So when I hear we need to prepare, to me, prepare means two things. It means, number one, that these changes are inexorable. They're so powerful, they're going to automatically happen like a tidal wave, and you got to prepare. Number one, I don't believe that. So the study we did about a year and a half ago where we looked at robot adoption by country and then controlling for wage levels. And for example, in South Korea, you have 700 robots per every 10,000 production workers, 700. In the US, we have 200. In Brazil, you have 10. In Russia, you have 4. And in India, you have 3. So the difference between 710 to 3. And then we looked at this model of sort of looking at the cost of a robot versus the payback and all these assumptions. And essentially a $250,000 robot in the US has a payback of about a year. In Mexico, because the labor compensation is so much lower, so you eliminate 2 workers with this robot, but when you're paying the workers not very much, you don't save very much money. So to get an ROI, a net present value, you have to go for 7 years. There are virtually no corporations that have a 7-year payback window. They're mostly now, they're down to 18 months, 24 months. No company invests thinking, well, I'm going to make it back in 7 years. In the Philippines, the payback is 30 years. So if you install a robot in the Philippines, 30 years later, you'll break even. So I actually think the risk is completely the opposite. And we're just not going to have that much of automation in developing countries because automation costs money and labor costs are low. So I think it's much more about how could developing countries move faster into that direction. For example, eliminating, signing on to the ITA agreement, the Information Technology Agreement, and eliminating taxes on capital goods. That's one way you could do that. And I 100% also agree with Susan. I think there's two dynamics going on. One is developed countries are going to adopt automation just because eventually the robots will get good enough, AI will get good enough. AI is not very good right now, it really isn't, but it's getting better. And robots still have problems, but they're getting better. So we're going to adopt those, and one of the effects of that is to reduce the effect of labor arbitrage. It just not going to make that much difference whether you're paying a high-skilled worker because you're so productive. And then to Susan's other point, it's not just about productivity, it's about customization and speed to market. And more of these technologies, particularly as you go into smart manufacturing, there's a study we did recently where we surveyed about 100 mid-sized manufacturers in the US, 1 billion to 10 billion in revenue, and asked them what their plans were to use AI in manufacturing. And most of them are early on, they're just dabbling, putting their toe in the water. But most of them want to do this within 5 years. And one of the benefits that they're going to get out of that is much more flexibility in production. So they're going to be able to make this thing 1 hour and this thing another hour. And this whole old model of where you're making, 100,000 of these, and so you might as well put them in China or Brazil, I think that's going to break down to some extent for some products. So again, I think the issue is much more about how do developing countries accelerate this. When it comes to skills, I'm skeptical. I don't think these countries don't need, people with graduate degrees. What they need are people with high school degrees. And I think if you ask, well, what are the skills that are going to be needed in these countries? It's somebody who has a high school degree, somebody who has basic literacy, some basic math, and not even algebra. I mean, algebra is way above most jobs. So I don't think it's super complicated. I think it's really all about how do you accelerate automation in these countries, things like tax and trade policies. How do you get just kind of more educated? How do you make the informal economy a lot smaller? The informal economy is basically an anti-productivity economy, and just small firms are incredibly unproductive. Big firms are much more productive. So again, part of it is moving away from this model in development of that micro firms are going to be the solution. Micro firms are the solution if you don't care about raising incomes. But if you care about raising incomes, micro firms are the problem. They're not the solution. It's mid-sized and large enterprises that are going to have to drive this. One last point, a good study that if you haven't seen it, which we've cited, 3 economists, Krenz, Pretner, and Strulick. They find that within manufacturing sectors in developed economies like Germany and the US, UK, adding 1 robot per 1,000 workers, so to go to that 10,000, for the U.S. going from 100 to 110, is associated with a 3.5% increase in reshoring. So I think this whole model we've looked at for the last 50 years, which was all in the direction of reshoring, all in the direction of labor arbitrage, I think we could be at a point where that's really fundamentally shifting in the exact opposite direction. And I don't think developing countries are really prepared for that, what that might mean.
Thank you very much, Rob. And now I'd like to move to Lynn and go inside the factory doors a little bit. So far, we've been focusing on robots displacing assembly line or manufacturing workers, but your research, Lynn, adds another layer about how managerial staff are actually more likely to get displaced. And this is based on your research in Canada. Tell us a bit about this. And it goes hand in hand with another question we just got from our online audience. Will humans be involved in complex decisions, or will even some of these be handed over to AI?
Great question. So my study actually looked at the entire Canadian economy, which we have the detailed metric of the robot adoption, what kind of robots are being bought over time for the last 20 years. And our results actually is very different from some of the earlier work that says 47% of jobs are being displaced. So we actually found that robot adopting firms are actually more productive and they hire more employees. So on average, we also look at industry effect. We actually also observe that robots are actually associated with greater employment in these industries as well. But I think looking at the raw number understates what actually is happening. There is a huge underlying change in employment. It's just not in the numbers. It's in the labor composition. So we do see a drastic increase in low-skilled labor. These are high school or below. You can think of that, the Pickers, Packard, and Amazon, right? And we see a much greater. We also see a greater increase in professional work. But we also see a decline in people with just an associate degree or just like technicians. And overall, we actually see employment goes up like this with robots, and manager actually go down drastically. And this is part for two reasons, right? So one is a direct substitution. When you have technology that can directly monitor what workers are doing, like Pickers, Packard, and Amazon, you can just have a camera. You don't really need to observe them so much. The fact they know there's a camera watching them. There's a famous study, report that shows that, I don't know how true it is, that Amazon will automatically fire you if you didn't make certain quota, and that's all from the IoT, the monitoring capabilities. I'm not saying it's widely adopted, but just saying that technology can monitor a lot of worker activities, especially for those standardized work that low-skill workers tend to occupy. And we also see that there's increase in professional work, right? Managing professional works are very different than managing lower wage work, lower skill work. You cannot be telling them what to do or making sure they show up on time. You need to be an enabler. You need to be a coach. This kind of a professional management is very different from a supervisor in the factory line. So overall, we do see not only that employment composition change, but the type of managers that are needed in the age of robot or in the age of AI is also changing, right? And we see this not just, we see that as managerial hiring is decreased, we also see managerial turnover is also increased, but managing from outside is actually increased a little bit. So we do see this huge change in type of managers that the firms are requiring. And that sounds like a rosy message in the sense, okay, employment's increasing, managers decreasing, okay, so what, right? But the problem is that now, because the employee composition has changed, the career ladder somewhat is broken, right? Before, you can be a entry worker, and if you do really well, you can be a supervisor and then go up the chain, right? But now that chain is being disrupted. So what does it mean for a worker entering and being a picker and packer at Amazon? How will they ever go up in the production chain? So that, I think, is a potentially important problem to think through. And that is not just about robots. You think about people going through the gig economy, right? They don't have this traditional workforce hierarchy anymore. So what does it mean for their career trajectories? Perhaps some of the skills training that Amy is doing might help. But largely, I want to emphasize that this robot's effect on employment, on jobs, is very complicated. It's not just about displacing. It's not as simple just robots are taking your jobs. Robots can be enabling, but enabling a particular type of jobs, and they may be displacing some other type of jobs. And finding the balance and finding how to manage that change, I think, is the critical thing we should think about in the future.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to throw a question to anybody who wishes to jump in. Do you see any particular challenges or opportunities for women with the arrival of these new technologies? Can automation, for example, have an impact on the gender division of labor? And feel free to quote the data, but also use anecdotes, because I know we have some fantastic and powerful women on this panel. So jump in.
Well, I would say, I think it depends on the data set you use. Our research shows it also depends on the country. But overall, so in the US, we find that women are slightly better off. They're less likely to be in a highly automatable job than a man. And when we look at future job growth and where that's coming from, a lot of it is in healthcare-related jobs, where women today predominate. So they are better positioned. That's not true in other countries. But I think the bottom line from as we look across countries is there's not a huge disparity. So women are not either better positioned or markedly worse off than men in the new age of technology and automation. So I think it will depend on the career paths and the education. I think it really increases the imperative that we raise female education beyond primary school through secondary school at least. And if we can do that, then there's no reason that the next era that's more technologically driven should be, worse for attaining gender parity.
So I agree. I would also add a couple of additional points. With AI and with technologies, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to address bias in the workforce and ethics in a different kind of a way. This tends to be a topic that women are very passionate about and very interested in. And so we see a lot of women who are taking that up in terms of their regulatory responsibility of all of us. But look, let's be honest, we've had challenges with diversity of all kinds in the workplace for many years. We will continue to do so, and we all have to work on it. It's not something that's going to naturally be solved with or without technology. We all have to continue on this path to proactively work on this topic together.
So I actually did some study on this particular topic, looking at how large firms, when they adopt automation technology or information technology at large, do they benefit women or do they not benefit women, or do they benefit newer employees or other demographics that are traditionally being disadvantaged? And we find the result to be quite interesting, that are two countervailing effects. Right. So we do find that technology enables you to find many things you wouldn't have otherwise found. Like, for example, your mobile app example, right? You have data immediately accessible to you. You can do all kinds of analysis on your own. So that empowers a new employee and women, because they don't need to go to a higher up. Hey, I need that data, but now I can just get it myself, and I can make that kind of contributions myself. And that actually enables women quite a bit, right? But problem is that you are just moving the bottleneck up. So now it's it's not about information access, not about enabling them at doing that particular job, but more of a decision up there, in the sense of, well, okay, now I've done this, I need somebody to actually back me up, to actually implement that in the real world. And then that's can be a problem. And then the social capital you have are going to be much more important. So we actually found what we call a network bias techno change, in a sense, not about gender, not about skills or the traditional learning skills, but your social skills, your social networking ability, and that is giving you the additional advantage. So in one sense, it solves some demographic-based institutional biases, but at the same time, it does entrench these people who have the social capital today. So the corresponding policy that we found is that, we need to somehow foster people, newer people or women who are traditionally do not have the social capital, to get those social capital as well, maybe having mentors with the senior managers, or having other type of socialization or mentorship that help people obtain that social capital to equalize that access. Because unfortunately, the social capital is actually a virtuous cycle. The more you have, the more you get, eventually it rolls up. And people who are at the very beginning just simply wouldn't be able to do that.
So we did an analysis where we looked at all 700 or so U.S. occupations, and then ranked each one of them by what we thought was a risk factor, 1 to 5 of automation. And then we also used the Osborne and Frey. Exactly, they had their own rankings, what they thought were the highest risk and the lowest risk. The main criticism I have of their study is the whole thing was just too high, but I think they got it generally right with terms of which ones are greater or lesser. And the results of our study were inconclusive. Very small correlation. I can't remember which was higher. But ours, let's just say ours was something like 0.7 correlation, very small correlation between gender and with women being slightly higher risk of being laid off, less than 0.1, and then the Osborne one being the opposite, men being slightly higher. So I kind of look at that as sort of a wash. What really I think is the big issue isn't gender, it's class. So when you look at skill levels, it's a negative 0.6 correlation. So that's a huge correlation. The lower the skill, the risk of automation. If you look at wage levels, it's again a negative 0.6. So I think this is really a class issue more than anything else. Upper middle and upper men and women will do fine, but working class people, I think it's going to be a much harder challenge for them. They're going to be much more likely to be laid off, and they have less human capital. They have less networks. I think that's what we should be thinking about most.
Thank you very much. And that really goes into this idea of inequality, of jobs, of access to health and education. So thanks for touching on that, Rob. Amy, I'd like to turn back to you. So IBM is a technology giant powered by human capital. How is IBM as an employer preparing itself for changes on the horizon? Are you finding the people that you need?
So it's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, IBM, as well as lots of large corporations and small, there aren't enough people in the marketplace to fit exactly our skill needs. There aren't enough of them. They don't exist. So we are adopting not only an approach of looking for people in the market, but we are reskilling our own people. We are really working very hard at adopting a culture of continuous learning and fostering ways that we together will move the needle on our own skill sets. We personalize learning for each individual. We actually infer what skills every individual has. So through lots of different types of technology today, we can infer what skill sets people have and their level of depth of capability. And we personalize learning programs for them in order so that they can learn those new skills. So that's what we do internally, but it's actually much broader than that. Again, we have partnerships with organizations who used to be our competitors. We're teaming up with local communities. Together, we are building the skills for the future and the ways to team and operate in a really different kind of a market. We're creating new industry forums together. We are creating ways in which we can operate on the cloud. So for example, we just deployed a new public cloud for the banking industry with Bank of America. And what this first public cloud in this industry allows us to do is when you think about robotics, just this is one example, but if you can have a public cloud for an industry that meets the regulatory requirements, it provides a whole new opportunity for that industry. And also, as we were talking about developing countries, a lot of the robotics, they actually don't need to be developed locally. They can actually be provided for globally on the cloud. So these advancements in technology actually enable us not only to prepare our own workforce, but inside a corporation, but to prepare the workforce of countries and communities and industries together. But it's really, again, it takes a lot of people to do this together. It's not one organization or another, one group or another. But one thing's for sure, we need a plan and we need to work on this together. It doesn't just happen.
Great, and to push on that further, we've talked a lot about what governments can do, what companies in developing countries can do to prepare for the future that lies ahead. What can organizations like the World Bank and advanced economies do to help prepare for that future? And I open this up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Well, I mean, part of it, I go back to this other thing. I think the risk is much more on the side of not having enough automation. If you look at, the average developing country, what you find is significant opposition to automation. It's not like they're chomping at the bit to get there. So I think one of the key things the World Bank could do would be to fund pilot programs where companies could do this. A good example, we actually did a study that the World Bank asked us to do looking at small SME manufacturing extension programs modeled after what the best programs in the world do, like in Japan, US, Canada, Germany, and the like. But when you look at these programs in Latin America, they're pretty underdeveloped and they're not very well funded. And yet those are the kinds of programs where you would go out and help SME manufacturers figure out, okay, how do I actually do this stuff? What are the steps that I need to go through to do this? I would be focusing a lot on that. Same thing on, as Susan alluded to, I think big impacts in service sector automation, banking. How can developing countries use fintech, for example? Again, you go to these countries and what you find oftentimes is that the powerful elites in these industries who have a deep in with government are the biggest resistors, the biggest opponents of that. And in many of these countries, you actually have a startup community and a sort of entrepreneurial community that just simply has a very hard time breaking in, much harder than they would in, say, Israel or US. And I think, again, how do you break down those kind of barriers to new entrants coming in and really using these technologies for the good?
Yeah, I would say do many of the things the World Bank is doing. Focus on human capital. It's ever more important. I think we all agree that if you're a low-skilled person anywhere in the world, your economic prospects are much, much bleaker as we adopt more technology. Secondly, think about climate change, not just about the adverse impact and the cost of climate events in developing countries, but as we think about things like greening your supply chain, what role can they play and how can they get ahead of that curve? And then finally, I would say really focus on lowering the cost of broadband access, the hardware. I mean, it still is a cruel irony that it costs the most to access the global internet in the poorest countries, people who have the least. And then enabling digital skills, because if you want to see this boom in the entrepreneurs and small businesses being able to tap into global markets, and take advantage of new types of business through platforms, you need to improve access to basic technology, hardware, software, and the data plans.
Make a quick comment. To Susan's point, we did a study recently where we looked at 120 countries, mostly developing countries, and we assessed how much they tax ICT equipment, including services and broadband, and how much they tariff them. And what you find is it's unbelievable. Places like Bangladesh, like 30%. Brazil, I was down in Brazil. How often you get to the U.S., I asked them, all the time we go there to buy our computers. And why do you do that? Because they tax them so much in Brazil. So that's easy to do. You just say we're not going to have tariffs on laptops, and we're not going to tax our broadband providers. And I think that would go a long way to Susan's point.
One last thing I want to add is that there's a lot of advantage being a developed economy in this new age of technology. Right, so you don't have the inertia that existing developed countries have because they already have a large enterprise system or a factory designed in a specific way to take advantage of a prior generation of technology. Right, so the best lesson we learn maybe in the developing countries could be immediately passed to developing country because they don't have the baggage or inertia to change an existing practice as we do in developed countries. So you can see this effect in the prior IT practices, the brown plan versus the green plan, right? So brown plans takes forever to use technology and they don't use it well. And then green plan, or just newer, who didn't have this baggage of existing technology or existing practices, they don't need to change, they don't face this much inertia. And that is something I think developed countries have advantage over developing countries have advantage over developed countries, and whatever best practices that we learn through developed country can be a value added or productivity enhancing way to just show them how to do it, and that may shortcut some of the hindrance that we face. Like for example, mobile banking, right? They don't need to do the enterprise. They don't have bank tellers. They go directly mobile, right? And that's a great example of just leapfrogging old or outdated practices. They simply never had to do it.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? I can't agree with you more, Lynn. And one of the things that technology now enables us to do is actually co-create and ask. One of the best things that we could do is ask the people in these developing countries, how can you learn? What can we do with you? And now with transparency, we can actually work on it together. And we haven't been able to do that in the past.
Thank you so much. And we have about a minute or so left. And I ask you, we've talked about human capital, we've talked about climate change, gender. Is there anything we're forgetting? A population, a continent, a sector? Is there something else that needs to be had in the discussion today to complete it?
We didn't talk much about policy. I know we probably did that on purpose. But I think it's important that we all recognize that ethics is a really, really important part of this because transparency is all over. And we need to make sure that we're driving good tech, not bad tech, because some bad things can happen. We need data security, privacy, and we need to adopt really a precision regulatory model that's not just broad across everything, but is really specific to topic. So I think that's an area that's going to require a lot more work.
I would just add, that reminded me, I think one of the biggest risks is now there's this demonization of these technologies. You see places now wanting to ban facial recognition technology, even though the most recent NIST studies show that the top 8 algorithms that were tested had zero bias. like zero bias. There were actually some algorithms that had higher rates of accuracy for African American women than they did white males. And then you see places wanting to, heavily regulate or ban AI or sidewalk delivery robots. And, I can see that for sort of, hyper liberals in San Francisco who already make a lot of money and don't care what happens. But when you see that same dynamic being played out in developing countries, it's very, very troublesome, because there's just now this sort of, it's almost become mythology that somehow AI is inherently biased. It's simply not true. It's just simply not true. AI can be biased, but it's not inherently biased. In fact, in many, many cases, AI is less biased because humans are biased. Humans are incredibly biased for all, not even if they intend to be. They're just, our brains are wired that way. We don't capture everything, whereas AI isn't. So I think that, to me, is one of the most important things. I was on some panel in Latin America, and it's just a sort of constant sort of attack on these technologies is really troubling, because the only way you're going to advance is to adopt and be a leading adopter of these technologies. And if you sort of go along with this kind of popular demonization from the neo-Luddites that these are really, really bad technologies, it just, again, the evidence shows that just simply is not the case.
Oh, I just want to echo that. But data privacy is really important. One of the, China being one of the most advanced AI development, they just have a lot more data than we do, and they can customize the application like the WeChat. If any of you use WeChat, it's like amazing. You don't ever have to leave WeChat. You can get your, you can they'll figure out, oh, your dog needs a shampooing, and then by the way, these are a provider, you can do it, and these are Uber will take you the dog to the shampooing places, and all in a single app. And that data provenance and data privacy is an important issue, and that the Western countries are talking about it. But there's a trade-off in to what extent the data can be used in the way that we want versus technology advancement to make people's life easier. So I think that trade-off is actually very important, and that requires regulatory and policy change.
All right, I'll say it. You asked what was missing. We had an entire panel and no one said 5G, so I'll just put it out there. But then I'll echo Rob saying, look, I think we've got to embrace technology. Don't run away from it. It has big potential for productivity and for gains, but do it thoughtfully.
Thank you. I think we can have a whole other panel based on what you just said to that last question. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. That does wrap up our time. And let's give them another round of applause, our fantastic panelists. So I'm sure you've had a lot of reactions to what was said on stage. Please continue the discussion online using the hashtag #RobotsAndJobs. There's also a lot to unpack and summarize here, so I welcome back on stage Bill Maloney, the Chief Economist for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions at the World Bank, to help us with doing so. Thank you all.
So I'll be super quick. I've been given 3 minutes, 45 seconds to sum up 2 hours of very provocative discussion. Some of it was just terminated. But let's just say that we confirmed that the effect of robots in the advanced countries is a complicated one, but that so far we haven't seen the strong displacement effect in the developing countries, partly because of this offshoring effect. New FDI brings the latest technologies and robots and all, but basically it also generates assembly work. So we've been seeing a kind of high-tech version of the flying geese pattern still ongoing. And Mary argued that just because replacement by robots is technically possible doesn't necessarily imply that actually it makes sense to, and hence there are broad areas where developing countries are going to be, developing country labor is going to continue to be the technology of choice for production. Both Susan Lund and Bob Riker stressed that robot adoption in the advanced countries actually lowers costs there, and there can be an income effect, which therefore actually creates more jobs in the developing world. I think I had that, Susan. Am I right? Yes. There's that. The effects of robotization, both in the advanced countries, may not be purely displacing and interrupting of the flying geese pattern. This said, there was some experience from Mexico where it had ambiguous net effects that are none found, and we have to pay attention to what those imply over the long run. In sum, the evidence seems so far that robots have yet to come for our jobs in a massive way in the developing world, and our guarded optimism is warranted. That said, we do see some incipient job loss in manufacturing the like in Mexico and Brazil, which we need to follow going forward. Susan also stressed that both the greening of the supply chain and the speed to market issues were going to pose challenges that countries are going to need to pay attention to if they wanted to maintain their attractiveness as a manufacturing base. Rob made the particular point that we're actually looking at this completely wrong, that the problem is a deficient adoption of new technologies in the developing world, and that, in fact, we could therefore look at the lack of a displacement effect, or the weak robot displacement effect, is actually kind of a problem, if you wanted, that we're seeing too slow adoption of technologies that are needed to grow and lift countries' citizens out of poverty. The two areas that seem to get some attention there were both on the overall enabling environment, and this includes everything from logistics to infrastructure to rule of law and the like, but also on the educational side. And we had a pretty rich discussion about what kinds of skills were going to be needed. Amy stressed, for instance, that the top skill gaps are actually not technological. They're actually social and soft skills, and that these are going to be important going forward, not only in the US, but everywhere, also in the developing world. That actually jives with some work that I know folks in HD have been doing over time, interviewing employers, stressing exactly these kinds of non-cognitive skills. I think Lynn made some very nice interventions in thinking we have to think about job displacement, or the kinds of the change in the demand, the job mix going forward. It's not just at the lower end, it's managerial skills are going to both be displaced to some degree, but also they're going to need to change what they do. And she also introduced an interesting human resource problem, which is you can enter these new firms at a moderate level, but there may be no long-run progress possible within that hierarchy, which is what I often think about the baristas. And therefore, that could be a HR problem motivating people over the long run. I think I'm getting close to my 3 minutes. Gender overall optimism or neutral? So far, no big negative impacts and some possibilities for positive impacts. Although Rob stressed we should really be looking more about issues of class, which is probably more an issue of education, right? We're talking about just that if you don't have the skills needed to complement the new technologies or to participate in the new industries that are emerging, then you will be left out. So on that, I don't know if I've missed major points, but I thank the panel very much, and thank you all for being here, and I turn it over to Zubi. Thank you.
Thank you, William, and thank you so much to our guests and speakers, and to you, our audience here in person and online. Please continue the conversation using the hashtag #RobotsAndJobs, and stay tuned for a recap of this event on World Bank Live. Take care.